There was a time when people believed that Rome would last forever, not as a figure of speech, not as a hope, as a simple fact about the world, as certain as the rising of the sun. They had a phrase for it, the eternal city, and they meant it exactly. Rome had always been there, in any living memory, and in the memory of everyone who had come before, and so it always would be. The idea that it could end was not frightening to them, because the idea did not occur to them at all. You do not fear the ending of a thing you cannot imagine ending. And for a long time, they were right to think so. Rome lasted, in one form or another, for more than 1,000 years. It grew from a village of mud huts on a few hills by a river into the greatest power the world had ever seen. An empire that wrapped itself all the way around a sea and reached from the cold rain of northern Britain to the hot sands of the African desert, from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the edge of the Persian world. Millions of people, hundreds of nations, 100 languages, all of them in the end Roman. Try to hold the size of it in your mind because it is hard to grasp now. A single state, a single government, a single system of law, stretching across 3 continents and around an entire sea. If you had been born in a village in the green hills of Britain and you traveled south and east for the rest of your life, you could have crossed the sea to the coast of France and walked the length of it and crossed the mountains into Italy and sailed to Greece and gone on to the ancient cities of the East and down into Egypt with its pyramids already unimaginably old, and along the whole northern coast of Africa, and never once in all those thousands of miles, in all those years of walking, have left the empire. The same coins in your purse, the same law over your head, the same language, more or less, in the marketplaces. One world held together by one city for centuries. Nothing like it had ever existed. It is not surprising that they thought it was eternal. In their whole world, it was the nearest thing to eternity that there was. And then it fell, slowly, so slowly that most of the people living through it did not know it was happening. Not in a day, not in a year, but across centuries, the greatest empire in the world came apart, piece by piece. Until one ordinary afternoon there was simply no Rome left in the West at all, and almost no one noticed the moment it happened, because by then there was hardly anything left to notice. Tonight and over the nights that follow, we are going to watch that happen. The whole long fall of Rome, from the very top, from the golden noonday of the empire when it ruled the world and knew it, all the way down through the long afternoon and the gathering dark, to the quiet end. It is one of the greatest stories there is, and it is a slow one, and a sad one, and in a strange way, at the very end a hopeful one. It is the perfect story to fall asleep to. But before we begin, if these quiet journeys into the deep past bring you some peace at the end of your day, take a moment to subscribe so that the next one can find its way to you when you need it. And I would love to know, from wherever you are resting tonight, in whatever corner of the world you happen to be, where are you listening from? And what hour has it reached where you are? Leave it in the comments below. It is one of my favorite things to see all the places and all the hours, all of us drifting off together. And now, let your shoulders drop, and let your breathing slow, and let the cares of your own day loosen their grip and fall away. Come with me back across 2,000 years to the city that ruled the world at the very height of its power, when no one alive could imagine it ever coming to an end. Let us begin at the top, because to understand how far Rome fell, you have to first understand how high it stood. Picture the empire at its greatest extent, at the high noon of its power. It has been growing for centuries, conquering, absorbing, spreading, and now it has reached its fullest size, and it is almost impossibly vast. It surrounds the entire Mediterranean Sea, every coast of it, every island in it. The Romans did not even call it the Mediterranean. They called it simply our sea, a whole sea, ringed on every side by one empire, so that a merchant could sail from one end of the known world to the other, and never once leave Roman waters, never once land on a shore that did not answer to Rome and the peace of it. This is the thing that is hard for us to grasp now, because we are so used to a world of many nations and many borders. For a long stretch at the height of the empire, across almost the entire civilized Western world, there was peace, one law, one coinage that was good everywhere. Roads, the famous roads, running straight as a spear across mountains and marshes and deserts, so that you could travel from the wall in the north of Britain all the way to the deserts of the east, thousands of miles, on paved roads in safety, under one flag. It had never happened before. It would not happen again for more than 1,000 years after Rome was gone. They called it the Roman Peace, and for the people who lived inside it, it must have felt like the natural and permanent state of the world. The wars were far away, out on the distant frontiers, fought by professional soldiers in lands most people would never see. In the heart of the empire, in the cities and the farms and the villas, life went on, prosperous and orderly and safe, generation after generation, and the legions on the borders kept the chaos out, the way a sea wall keeps out the sea, so completely that you forget the sea is even there. There is a line from one of the writers of the age that captures it perfectly. He marveled that a traveler could now cross the whole world in safety, and that the sea had been swept clear of pirates, and that a man could journey from country to country as if each were his own homeland. Think of what that meant in the ancient world, where beyond the reach of a strong state, the roads had always belonged to bandits and the seas to pirates, and travel had always meant risking your life. For a few golden generations, across an area larger than any state before or since, that fear simply lifted. A merchant could load his goods and travel 1,000 miles to sell them. A young man from the provinces could come to the great city to seek his fortune. Ideas and goods and people flowed freely from one end of the known world to the other, all under the same law, all under the same peace. People had never known anything like it, and having known it, they could not imagine losing it, any more than we can imagine the ground itself giving way beneath our feet. And at the center of it all, the city itself. Rome, the first true city of 1 million people the world had ever seen. Nothing that size had ever existed. It would not be matched anywhere in the world for over 1,000 years, and in the West not until the modern age. 1 million people, crammed into a space that would seem small to us now, in a chaos of noise and smell and color and life. Picture it, the great public buildings gleaming white marble and gold, temples and law courts, and the halls of government rising up above everything. The forums, the great public squares, packed with people, orators shouting, merchants selling, philosophers arguing, priests sacrificing, the business of the world being done, the triumphal arches carved with the victories of emperors, the columns reaching to the sky, wound round with the story of some distant war, and the baths. The Romans loved to bathe, and the great public baths of the city were among the wonders of the world, vast palaces of leisure with hot rooms and cold rooms and warm rooms, swimming pools, exercise yards, gardens, libraries, all of it open to ordinary people, all of it heated by fires tended by slaves in the tunnels beneath the floors. A working man in Rome could spend his afternoon in a marble hall more magnificent than the palace of many a later king, and think nothing of it because it was simply his to use. And the water that made it all possible, carried into the city from the distant hills by the aqueducts, those great arched bridges striding across the countryside on their long stone legs, some of them running for tens of miles, all to bring fresh, clean water to the fountains and the baths and the houses of the city. The engineering of it is staggering even now. The water ran downhill the whole way, mile after mile, dropping just a few inches for every mile so gently and so precisely that it flowed steady and true across an entire landscape, over valleys, through hills, into the heart of the city, by nothing but the pull of the earth, and the perfect judgment of men who had no machines to help them. Rome had more clean running water than any city on earth would have again until the 19th century, more than 1,000 years after Rome fell. The Romans built so well that some of those aqueducts still stand today, 2,000 years later, and some still carry water. Their roads still run under the fields of Europe. Their walls still stand in 100 towns. Their concrete, a secret recipe that was lost for centuries after them, has outlasted much of what we build today. They built for eternity because they believed in eternity, and a strange thing happened as a result. They built so well that their ruins would haunt the world for the next 2,000 years, so that every age that came after would look at what Rome had left behind, the roads and the arches and the vast broken monuments, and feel small and wonder how such things had ever been made. and whether they themselves could ever build the like again. Rome's greatness would outlive Rome and become a kind of reproach to everyone who followed. But we are getting ahead of ourselves and the games. This is the darker side of the glory, and we should not look away from it. In the great oval arena at the heart of the city, the one whose ruin still stands today, and is still one of the most recognized shapes in the world, tens of thousands of people would gather on free days paid for by the emperor to watch men fight and die. Gladiators, some of them slaves, some of them prisoners, some of them free men who chose the life for the glory and the money, fighting each other, and fighting wild animals brought from the ends of the empire, lions and bears and elephants, and in the intervals, the public execution of criminals killed in elaborate and terrible ways for the entertainment of the crowd. That great arena could hold 50,000 people or more, and it could be emptied and filled in minutes through dozens of arched gates, a feat of crowd management that modern stadiums still copy. Beneath its floor was a hidden world of tunnels and cages and lifts, where the beasts and the fighters waited in the dark below the sand, and were raised up on wooden platforms to appear suddenly in the blazing light and the roar of the crowd. They could even, on occasion, flood the whole arena with water and stage mock sea battles on it, with real ships and real men who really died. The scale of the spectacle, the sheer inventive lavishness of it, was meant to overwhelm, to say to every citizen and every visitor from a conquered land, "This is Rome. This is what Rome can do. Be amazed and be afraid." And the crowd loved it, roared for it, lived for it. An ordinary Roman could watch in the course of a single day exotic animals from 3 continents slaughtered by the hundred, condemned prisoners torn apart or burned or crucified, and trained gladiators fighting to the death, and go home satisfied, and think himself a member of the most civilized society on earth. And he was not wrong about the civilization. That is what makes it so hard to hold. The same people who built the aqueducts and wrote the poetry and framed the laws that still shape our own, sat in their tens of thousands and cheered while men and beasts died on the sand below, and felt nothing but pleasure. It was magnificent, and it was monstrous, and it was both at the same time, and that is Rome. A civilization of law and engineering and poetry and philosophy, of roads and aqueducts and a peace that spanned the world, that also gathered its citizens by the tens of thousands to watch human beings butchered for sport, and saw no contradiction in it at all. We will come back to that, because the thing that a civilization is willing to do, and the thing it is willing to watch, tells you something about where it is going. Now that is the Rome of the marble and the gold, the Rome of the postcards. But most Romans did not live in marble, and it is worth going down, for a moment, from the gleaming public squares into the streets where the ordinary million actually lived, because the truth of the great city is stranger and more human than the monuments suggest. Rome was the first great high-rise city in history, and it was, for most of its people, a crowded, filthy, dangerous, wonderful slum. The poor did not live in villas. They lived stacked on top of one another in tall apartment blocks, flimsy things thrown up quickly and too high, several floors of small rented rooms, and the higher you climbed, the poorer you were, because the rich took the cool ground floors and the poor toiled up the stairs to the cramped hot rooms under the roof. The buildings caught fire constantly, for everyone cooked and lit their rooms with open flame, and there was no real fire brigade for much of the city's history, and a fire in one of those towering tenements could kill everyone above the flames. And they collapsed too, the cheap ones, thrown down by greedy landlords, sometimes with the people still inside. There was no running water up in those rooms and no drains. You fetched your water from the public fountains in the street below and carried it up, and you carried your waste back down, or you did not bother and simply threw it out of the window into the street, which is a thing that genuinely happened, so often that there were laws about who had to pay if the contents of a chamber pot landed on a passerby's head. The streets themselves were narrow, dark, and lawless after dark. There was no police force to speak of. At night, the city belonged to thieves and gangs, and a person of sense did not go out without a torch and a servant or two, if they could afford them. By day, the streets were a river of noise and press and stink and life. Wagons banned during daylight so the crowds could move, so that the deliveries came at night, and no one in Rome ever truly slept for the rumble of cartwheels on stone. And yet the people loved it and poured into it from every corner of the world because it was the center of everything, the place where things happened, where a nobody from a distant province could arrive with nothing and, just possibly, become something. Every language on earth was spoken in those streets. Every god was worshipped. Every kind of food was sold from the little shops and stalls, for the poor had no kitchens and ate out, buying hot food from the counter the way a city person does today. It was crowded and cruel and dirty and alive, gloriously alive, the beating heart of the world, and there had never been anything like it. Hold both of those Romes in your mind together, because both are true. The one of gleaming marble and running water and eternal confidence, and the one of dark stairwells and fire and filth and a million people packed together in the roaring dark. That was the city. That was the thing that ruled the world. But above all, hold the certainty of it, the deep, unshakable, absolute certainty in the mind of every single person alive within it, rich and poor, in the villa and in the garret, that this was how the world was, and how it would always be. Rome was eternal. Everyone knew it. It was the one fixed and certain thing in a changing world. Rest there for a moment, in the noonday of the empire, in the warm marble and the running water and the endless confident hum of a million people who have never once doubted that their city will stand forever. There is a great comfort in that certainty, even now, even knowing what we know. Let yourself feel it. The world is settled, the peace will hold, the roads will always run and the water will always flow and Rome will always be there. And now gently, let me begin to show you the cracks, because they were there. Even at the very top, even in the golden noonday, the cracks were already there, running quietly through the foundations, so fine that no one could see them, so deep that nothing could ever truly mend them. The seeds of the fall were planted at the very height of the glory. They always are. That is the oldest and saddest pattern in all of history. The thing that makes a civilization great is so often the very thing that in the end brings it down. Let me show you the first crack, and it is the deepest one, and almost no one at the time understood it at all. Rome had grown great by conquest. That was the engine of the whole thing. For centuries, Rome had gone out and conquered its neighbors, and then its neighbors' neighbors, and each conquest brought wealth pouring back into the city, gold and silver and land, tribute from the defeated, and above all, slaves. Every war brought captives, tens of thousands of them, hundreds of thousands, and they were marched back to Italy and put to work, in the fields, in the mines, in the houses of the rich, building the roads and the aqueducts and the marble halls. The whole magnificent machine ran on conquest. The wealth that built the baths and paid for the games and fed the million people of the city, so much of it came from the next war, and the next and the next. Rome was like a fire that had to keep spreading, to keep burning, always needing new lands, new plunder, new slaves to feed the blaze at the center. And the slaves were the hidden foundation of the whole thing, the thing we tend not to see when we picture the marble and the glory. Rome was a slave society to a degree that is hard to grasp. In the great days, a huge part of the population, in some places perhaps a third of it, were slaves, owned like furniture, worked in the fields and the mines and the workshops and the great houses, with no rights and no freedom, their whole lives the property of another. It was slaves who dug the silver out of the mountains, in conditions so brutal that few survived it long. It was slaves who rowed the ships and worked the great estates and tended the fires beneath the marble floors of the baths. The leisure of the Roman citizen, the free afternoons at the baths and the games, rested on the unfree labor of millions of human beings whose names we will never know. And this too depended on conquest, for the wars were what supplied the slaves, in their endless hundreds of thousands. So when the conquest slowed, the supply of new slaves slowed with them, and the great estates that fed on cheap human labor began, slowly, to feel the pinch and to look for other ways to work the land. And the whole quiet economy of the empire began, in ways no one quite noticed, to shift and strain. Everything connected to everything. Pull one thread, the conquests and a dozen others far away, began imperceptibly to loosen. And then, at the height of the empire, the conquering stopped. Not all at once, and not by any single decision, But the empire reached in the end the limits of what it could easily swallow. To the north lay the deep, dark forests of the barbarian lands, full of fierce tribes and worth little in plunder, hard to conquer and harder to hold. To the east lay the other great empire of the age, the Persian world, an enemy Rome could fight but never truly defeat, a wall it could not pass. To the south lay the desert, and beyond it, nothing the Romans wanted. To the west lay the ocean and the edge of the world. There was one moment early on that seemed to mark the limit forever. Rome had pushed north into the great forests of the German lands, meaning to swallow them as it had swallowed Gaul and Spain. And deep in those dark woods, 3 whole legions, tens of thousands of men, the finest soldiers in the world, were led into a trap by the tribes and slaughtered, cut to pieces over days in the rain and the trees, until almost none were left. The eagles, the sacred standards of the legions, were lost in the mud. When the news reached the emperor, an old man by then, it broke him. The story goes that he wandered his palace in the night, beating his head against the doors, crying out for the general to give him back his legions. Rome never seriously tried to take those forests again. It pulled back to the great river and made the river the border, and there the border stayed. The forest had said no, and Rome for once had listened, and the men in those trees, and their sons and their sons' sons, would still be there, waiting on the far bank, growing in number, when the long afternoon of the empire finally came. Rome had grown as large as it could grow, and the moment it stopped growing, the engine that had powered everything began, very quietly, to fail. The rivers of plunder slowed to a trickle, the floods of new slaves dried up. The wealth that had always come from the next conquest stopped coming, because there was no next conquest, or none worth having. And an empire that has been built to expand, that has organized its entire economy and its entire idea of itself around endless growth, does not know how to simply stop and stay still. It is like a shark that must keep swimming to breathe. The moment Rome stopped growing, it began in the deepest and slowest way to die, but so slowly, so very slowly, that it would take centuries for anyone to feel it, and by then it would be far too late. That is the first crack, and the deepest. An empire that could only live by growing, that had grown as far as it could grow. Here is the second. And this one you can see if you look in the very coins in people's hands. Rome ran on money, like any great state. It had to pay its soldiers, tens of thousands of them, standing guard on the far frontiers. It had to pay for the grain that fed the million people of the city, given out free or cheap to keep them content. It had to pay for the games and the roads and the whole vast machinery of government. And when the conquest stopped and the plunder stopped, the money to pay for all of this had to come from somewhere else. From taxes, squeezed ever harder out of the empire's own people. And when even that was not enough, the emperors did a subtle and fatal thing. They cheated the coins. A Roman silver coin was supposed to be silver, or very nearly. But an emperor who was short of money, and they were always short of money, could call in the coins and melt them down and mix the silver with cheaper metal and mint new coins that looked the same but held less silver. And with the same amount of real silver, he could now make more coins and pay more soldiers and cover more of his debts. It must have seemed clever. It must have seemed almost free, but it was not free. Nothing is ever free. Over the years, over the generations, the emperors did this again and again, each one debasing the coinage a little more, until a silver coin was barely silver at all, just a thin wash of it over a lump of base metal. And people are not fools. Merchants began to notice that the new coins were worth less than the old. Prices began to rise. The coins bought less and less. And slowly across the empire, trust in the money itself began to fail. And when the money fails, everything that depends on the money begins quietly to fail with it. And once that unraveling begins, it feeds on itself, and it is almost impossible to stop. As the coins are worth less, prices rise, so the state needs still more coins to pay its bills, so it debases the coinage further, so prices rise faster still. In the worst years, prices ran wild, doubling and doubling again, until a lifetime's savings became worthless, and no one knew from one month to the next what anything was worth. People stopped trusting money altogether and went back, in places, to simple barter, trading goods for goods like their distant ancestors, in the middle of the most sophisticated economy the ancient world had ever built. The state itself, unable to rely on its own coins, began demanding its taxes in goods, in grain and cloth and labor, rather than in cash it could no longer trust. You could hold a Roman coin in your hand, in the later days, and see the whole decline of the empire written in it. The old coins, heavy and bright with real silver from the days of glory, and the new ones light and dull, more copper than silver, from the days of decline. The same face of an emperor stamped on both, but one of them a promise kept, and the other a promise broken. The empire was, quite literally, becoming less than it pretended to be, and everyone who handled money could feel it, could weigh it in their palm, even if they could not have said why, or what it meant, or where it would lead. There is the second crack. A great state living beyond its means, cheating its own money to pay its bills, and hollowing out the trust that held everything together. And here is the third, and in some ways the most human and the most dangerous of all. Who was to rule? In the early days, Rome had been a republic, governed by its Senate and its assemblies, with power shared and passed along by law and custom. A system that, for all its faults, had a kind of stability, because no one person held everything. But that had ended long before the height of the empire. By the time of the glory we have been describing, Rome was ruled by one man, the emperor, and an emperor held more power than almost any human being in history. Power over the lives of millions, command of the armies, control of the treasury. The authority of a living god, for many of them were worshipped as gods. And there was no clear, fixed, reliable rule for how one emperor should follow another. Think about what that means. The most powerful position in the world, and no settled way to decide who should hold it. Sometimes an emperor named his son, and the son inherited. Sometimes an emperor named an adopted heir, a capable man chosen for his ability, and this often worked well. But sometimes an emperor died suddenly, with no heir named. And sometimes an emperor was simply weak, or cruel or mad, and someone decided that they would make a better ruler, and they had an army behind them, and they took the throne by force. Because that was the terrible secret at the heart of the whole system, and everyone came in time to understand it. In the end, an emperor ruled because the soldiers obeyed him, and if the soldiers could make an emperor, then the soldiers could unmake him too, and make another. The army, which existed to protect Rome from its enemies, slowly discovered that the greatest prize in the world was Rome itself, and that they held the power to hand it to whomever they pleased, or to whoever would pay them most. There would come a day, in the worst of the decline, when this reached its lowest and most shameful point, and it is worth telling now, because it shows exactly where the crack was leading. The emperor's own bodyguard, the elite troops stationed in the capital itself, murdered the emperor, and then, finding themselves with the throne of the world in their hands and no one to give it to, they did the unthinkable. They auctioned it. They put the empire of Rome up for sale to the highest bidder, and a rich old man bought it, bought the entire Roman world, with a promise of gold to every soldier, and was proclaimed emperor on the strength of his payment. He lasted only a few weeks before he was killed in his turn, but the thing had been done, and could never be unseen. The throne of the eternal city had been sold like a horse at market. That was where the flaw led, in the end, once the strong hands were gone, and there was nothing left to hold it in check. At the height of the glory, this was still mostly held in check by strong emperors and long habit and good fortune. But the flaw was there, in the foundation, waiting. A throne of absolute power with no sure law of succession, guarded by armies who were learning that they could seize that throne for themselves. It was a machine built for civil war. It just had not started yet, and bound up with this was a slow change in the army itself, so gradual that no one chose it, and yet it changed everything. In the old days, the legions had been made of Roman citizens, farmers and townsmen who took up arms for a time and then went home, men who fought for Rome because Rome was theirs. But as the centuries passed and the frontiers grew longer and the wars grew farther away, the army became a permanent professional thing, a career, made up of men who signed on for 25 years and knew nothing else. And more, Those men were not from Rome or Italy at all. They were provincials, from the edges of the empire, and in time they were not even citizens to begin with, but foreigners, men from the very barbarian peoples the legions were meant to hold back, hired to do the fighting that the comfortable citizens of the heartland no longer wished to do themselves. Now for a long while this worked, and worked well. A tough recruit from the frontier could become as Roman as anyone, prouder of the eagles than any soft city dweller. And the army stayed loyal and strong. But something had shifted underneath that would matter enormously in the end. The defense of Rome had been placed more and more in the hands of men who were not Roman by birth, who fought for pay and for a career rather than for a homeland, and whose loyalty was to their general and their wages rather than to the distant idea of the eternal city. When the pay was good and the generals were strong, this was invisible. But it meant that the sword that guarded Rome was increasingly held by hands that had no deep reason to love her. And a day would come when that would matter more than anything. And there is a fourth crack, quieter than the others, harder to see, and the Romans themselves worried about it more than any of the rest. They called it the loss of the old virtue. In the early days, when Rome was small and hard and hungry, its people had been famous for a certain grim discipline. They farmed their own land, they fought their own wars, they lived simply, they served the state without pay, they held duty above pleasure and the community above the self. There was a legend they loved to tell about an early Roman hero who was called from his plough to lead the armies, saved the state, and then, refusing all reward and power, went straight back to his farm and his plough. That was who they believed they were. Hard, plain, dutiful farmers who happened to conquer the world. And by the height of the empire, that Rome was a memory and a reproach. The city was rich now, unimaginably rich, drowning in the plunder of the world. And with the riches had come everything that riches bring. Luxury on a scale that shocked even the Romans, feasts that lasted for days, fortunes spent on a single fish, a single cup, a single party, an idle mob in the capital, hundreds of thousands of citizens who did no work and lived on free grain handed out by the state, and who had to be kept quiet and content with the endless bloody entertainments of the arena. Bread and circuses, they called it. Feed the people and amuse them, and they will not ask who rules them or how. And the old Romans, the writers and moralists, watched this and wrung their hands and wrote that Rome was rotting from within, that the old hard virtue was gone, that a people who had conquered the world by discipline were now being softened and corrupted by the very wealth that conquest had won. Every generation they said the same. Every generation was sure that the real Rome, the good Rome, the Rome of their grandfathers, was already lost, and that they were living in the decadent shadow of it. How much of this was true, and how much was simply old men complaining that the world was not as good as it used to be, is hard to say, and historians argue about it still. Perhaps a civilization does not really die of luxury and idleness. Or perhaps it does slowly, the way a body grows soft and weak when it no longer has to struggle. But whether or not it was the cause of anything, the feeling was real, and it ran all through the later empire like a low, sad music, the sense that something had been lost, that the greatness was behind them, not ahead, that they were the heirs of giants living in a world their ancestors had built, and they themselves could no longer quite hold up. There they are, the great cracks running through the golden marble at the very height of the empire's glory. An empire that could only live by growing, and had stopped growing. A state living beyond its means and cheating its own money to survive. A throne of absolute power with no safe way to pass it on, watched by hungry armies, and a people who felt in their bones that their best days were already behind them. None of these was fatal on its own. None of these brought Rome down by itself. Rome was strong, immensely strong, and it would stand for centuries yet, and there would be great emperors and golden summers still to come. A crack in a foundation does not bring the house down the next day, or the next year, or perhaps for a very long time. The house can stand for generations, with the cracks running quietly through its base, and everyone who lives in it can go about their lives in comfort and never know that anything is wrong. But the cracks are there, and they do not mend. And slowly, so slowly, under the weight of the years, they widen. There is something worth sitting with quietly before we leave the golden noon. All of those cracks, every one of them, was invisible to the people living at the top of the world. A citizen strolling through the marble forum at the height of the empire, on his way to the baths, with the free grain in his belly and the games to look forward to, felt no crack beneath his feet at all. He felt the warm certainty of a world that had always been and always would be. The decline that we can see so clearly, looking back, was to him not even a rumor. It was nothing. It was less than nothing. The idea would have made him laugh, and that perhaps is the truest and gentlest lesson in the whole long story, and a strangely comforting one to carry toward sleep. The people inside the Golden Age never know they are inside it, and the people at the beginning of the long decline never know that either. Life simply goes on, day by ordinary day, the water running and the bread arriving and the sun coming up, and the great slow tides of history move far too slowly for any single human life to feel them. The Romans were not fools, and they were not blind. They were simply living their lives as we all do, inside a moment that felt permanent, and was not. That is where we will pick up the story next. The long, slow widening of the cracks, the centuries when Rome began, at last, to feel its own decline, when the armies turned on each other and made and unmade emperors like a bloody game, when the money failed and the cities shrank and the far frontiers began, here and there, to give way. The long afternoon of the empire, when the shadows begin, very gradually to lengthen. But not tonight. Tonight, let Rome stand in its glory a little longer. Let the marble gleam and the water run, and the million people go about their lives under the endless, confident sun, certain, every one of them, that their city is eternal. Let them have their golden noon. The afternoon will come soon enough. It always does. So rest now, wherever you are, in whatever hour has found you. Let the great city stand shining in your mind, whole and magnificent and sure of itself, at the very height of its long day. Let the roads run to the ends of the earth, and the sea lie calm and Roman under the sun, and the peace hold, and the certainty hold, just a little longer. Let the fountains play in the marble squares. Let the water run down from the hills through the long stone arches, the way it has run for lifetimes, the way it seems it always will. Let the crowds fill the streets and the great arena roar, and the free grain arrive in the harbor, and a million people lie down to sleep in the roaring dark of the greatest city the world has ever seen, none of them dreaming, not one that any of it could ever end. There is nothing you need to carry tonight. The cracks in the foundation are not yours to mend. The long fall is not yours to stop. It happened long ago to people long gone, and it is only a story now, a slow and quiet story to carry you down into sleep. Let your breathing slow. Let the marble gleam and fade. Let the eternal city keep its watch through the night, as it believed it always would. And sleep now. The empire will still be here in the morning. For a while yet, it always was. The cracks held for a long time. That is the thing to understand as we come back to the story tonight. The flaws we traced last time, the empire that could only live by growing and had stopped growing, the money quietly failing, the throne with no safe way to pass it on, the armies learning their own power, all of that was there, running through the foundations at the very height of the glory. And still, for generations, the house stood. The water ran, the peace held, great emperors came and went. The sun of the empire seemed as high and as warm as it had ever been, because a crack in a foundation is patient. It does not bring the wall down in a day. It waits. It waits for a storm. And here is the thing about a great and solid structure, whether a building or an empire. It can bear an astonishing amount of damage and still stand, as long as no single blow is too great. And as long as the blows do not all come at once. A wall with a crack in it can carry its load for 100 years, but let the ground shift and the rains come, and a great weight lean against it all in the same season, and the crack that waited so patiently for so long will open in a single dreadful moment, and the wall will come down. It was always going to come down. The crack was always there, but it needed the storm to finish it. And until the storm came, everyone could walk past the wall every day and call it sound. And then, at last, the storm came. Tonight we are going to live through the long, slow coming apart of the Roman world. Not the final fall, not yet, that is still ahead of us. But the century when the cracks first widened into gaps, when the whole empire came within a breath of collapse, and then the long, strange afternoon that followed, when clever and desperate men held the thing together by remaking it into something harder, colder and sadder than it had ever been before. This is the middle of the story, the shadows lengthening, the light going gold and then grey. But before we begin, if these quiet journeys through the deep past bring you a little peace at the end of the day, take a moment to subscribe, so the next one can find its way to you when you need it. And I would love to know from wherever you are resting tonight, in whatever corner of the world you happen to be, where are you listening from, and what hour has it reached where you are? Leave it in the comments below. I love to see all the places and all the hours, all of us drifting off together under the same old stars. And now, let your shoulders come down, and let your breathing slow, and let the day you have carried loosen and fall away. Come with me back to the Roman world, some generations on from its golden noon, as the first great storm breaks over it. For a long time, the emperors who ruled Rome had mostly been able men, or at least competent ones, and power had passed, more or less, in an orderly way. There had been a long run of wise rulers, one after another, each choosing a capable successor, and under them the empire had reached its greatest height and its deepest peace. It was, people later said, the happiest time in the history of the human race, or at least the most comfortable. But it rested, all of it, on the character of the man at the top, and on the luck of good men following good men. And luck like that does not hold forever. And then it broke. A cruel and unstable emperor, the son of a wise father, undid much of the good that had been built. And after him, the thing everyone had always feared but never quite seen came true. The armies remembered their power, and once they remembered it, they could not forget. That cruel young emperor is worth pausing on, because he marks the turning, the moment the long golden afternoon began to slide toward evening. His father had been perhaps the noblest of all the emperors, a philosopher on the throne, a man who wrote in the quiet of his tent on the frontier, in the middle of endless wars, a little book of private reflections on duty and mortality and how to live a good life, a book so wise and so human that people still read it and find comfort in it 18 centuries later. He held the empire together by sheer character through plague and war, and he was the last of the long line of good emperors, and his son, whom he left the throne to, was his opposite in every way. Vain, cruel, obsessed with the games, he fancied himself a living god and a great gladiator, and went down into the arena himself to fight before a crowd that had to cheer or die. He neglected the hard work of ruling, handed the real power to favorites, drained the treasury and made himself so hated and so feared that in the end he was strangled by his own people, in his own palace, by those closest to him. And with his death, the orderly succession that had given Rome its golden age was shattered and could not be put back together. The good emperors had chosen their heirs by merit. Now the throne was up for grabs again, and the armies were watching, and they had learned long ago exactly what they were capable of. What followed was a nightmare that lasted 50 years, and it very nearly ended Rome then and there, more than 2 centuries before the date we usually call the fall. Historians call it the crisis. For half a century, the empire tore itself apart. Emperor after emperor was raised up by his soldiers, ruled for a year or 2 or 3, and was murdered, usually by his own men or killed in battle by a rival, raised up by other soldiers somewhere else. In 50 years there were dozens of emperors, some ruling for only a few months, almost none of them dying in their beds. The throne became a death sentence. To be proclaimed emperor was, more often than not, to be signing your own murder, a few months or years down the road. Think about what that meant for the empire. There was no longer any center that held. While the generals fought each other for the throne, no one was guarding the frontiers, and the enemies who had always been kept out, the tribes beyond the northern rivers, the great rival empire in the east, saw the legions marching inward to kill each other instead of outward to keep the borders. And they came. They poured across the frontiers that no one was watching. They raided deep into lands that had not seen an enemy in centuries, lands where the towns had no walls because no one had ever imagined they would need them. For the first time in living memory, the war came home. And it got worse because, A wounded empire is a sick empire. In the middle of the chaos came a great plague sweeping through the crowded cities, killing by the thousands and the tens of thousands, emptying whole districts, so that on top of the war and the murder and the raiding there was now disease, carrying off soldiers and farmers and emperors alike. And the money, already weak, now collapsed almost completely, the coins so debased that they were nearly worthless, prices soaring beyond all reason, the whole economy of the Roman world grinding toward a halt. For 50 years this went on. War, murder, invasion, plague, ruin. The empire split into pieces, whole regions breaking away under their own local emperors, simply to defend themselves because the center could no longer protect anyone. It seemed, to anyone living through it, that the world was ending, that Rome, the eternal city, was finally actually dying. And it was closer to the truth than they knew. Rome came within a hair's breadth of vanishing, right there, in the middle of the 3rd century of our era. And there was one moment in those years that showed the whole depth of how far Rome had fallen, a thing that would once have been unthinkable. An emperor of Rome, at the head of his army, marched east to fight the great rival empire, and he was defeated and he was captured alive, taken prisoner, the living emperor of the Roman world, the master of the earth, a prisoner in the hands of a foreign king, and the stories that came back were bitter almost beyond bearing. It was said that the foreign king used the captured emperor as a living footstool, that whenever he wished to mount his horse, he made the Roman emperor kneel in the dust so that he could step on his back to climb up, and that when the old emperor finally died in captivity, his body was flayed, and the skin dyed and stuffed and hung up in a temple as a trophy, so that the ambassadors of Rome coming to that distant court in the years after would be shown the skin of their own emperor hanging on the wall. Whether every detail of that is true, we cannot know, but that such a story could be told at all, and believed, tells you everything about the age. The emperor of Rome, who was worshipped as a god, whose image stood in every temple and on every coin, could be captured, humiliated, and killed like a slave, and turned into a footstool and a trophy, and Rome could do nothing about it. The mask of eternal, invincible majesty had been torn away, and underneath was a frightened, bleeding, mortal thing. Everyone could see it now. And once a thing is seen, it cannot be unseen. Rest a moment in that, but gently, because this is the darkest hour before a strange dawn. Picture the Roman world in those years, the frontiers broken, the cities, for the first time in centuries, throwing up hasty walls out of the rubble of their own grand monuments, tearing down temples and tombs to build defenses, because the peace that had made walls unnecessary was gone, the roads no longer safe, the coins worthless, emperors flickering past like candle flames in a draught, each one snuffed out almost as soon as he was lit. A whole world that had believed itself eternal, suddenly staring into the dark. Imagine being alive then, an ordinary person, a farmer or a shopkeeper or a mother, who had grown up in the settled certainty of the Roman peace, who had been told all your life that Rome was eternal and the world was safe. And now the tax collectors came twice as often and took twice as much. The money in your hand bought less every month. Word came of a city sacked that had not seen an enemy in 300 years. A new emperor was proclaimed, and then another, and you lost track of who was supposed to be ruling. Plague passed through your town and took a third of the people you knew, and nobody could tell you why or when it would end, or whether it would end, because they did not know either. The whole solid world of your childhood was coming apart in your hands, and there was nothing to hold on to. That is what it is to live through the fall of an age. Not a single great catastrophe, but 1,000 small ones, and beneath them all the slow, terrible draining away of the certainty that the ground beneath your feet would hold. And then, against all odds, it did not fall. Because out of that same army, out of that same chaos of soldier emperors, there came at last a run of hard men. Tough soldiers risen from the ranks, often from the rough frontier provinces, men with no softness in them at all, who took the dying empire in their fists and, by sheer brutal will, dragged it back from the edge. They beat back the invaders. They crushed the rival emperors and reunited the broken pieces. They restored the frontiers. Slowly, savagely, they pulled the Roman world back together. But here is the thing, and it is the heart of the whole second act of this long story. they saved Rome. But to save it, they had to change it into something else. The empire that came out the far side of that crisis was not the empire that had gone in. It survived, but it survived the way a man survives a terrible illness that leaves him permanently altered, harder and colder and more fearful than the person he had been before. Let me show you what they built, because it is the shape of the whole rest of the story. The old empire had at least pretended to be a kind of republic still, with an emperor who was called merely the first citizen, first among equals, who wore the ordinary dress of a senator, and who ruled, in theory, alongside the ancient Senate. That pretense was over now. The new emperors dropped the mask entirely. They made themselves into remote, sacred, absolute monarchs, god-kings in the Eastern style, wrapped in silk and jewels and ceremony. You no longer met the emperor as a fellow citizen. You approached him, if you approached him at all, through layers of officials, and when you reached him, you prostrated yourself on the floor before him as before a god, and if you were permitted, you kissed the hem of his robe. The emperor had become something between a king and a god, hidden away behind a wall of ritual, unreachable, terrifying, divine. Everything around him became sacred and stiff and heavy with ceremony. His bedchamber was the sacred bedchamber. His treasury was the sacred treasury. Even the sight of him was rationed and staged, so that when he did appear in his jeweled robes and his diadem, stiff with gold, motionless, painted almost like an icon, he seemed less a man than a holy image of power itself. The living, joking, sometimes almost ordinary emperors of the early days, who had walked in the forum and traded letters with their friends and could be spoken to by a citizen, were gone forever. In their place was this remote, glittering god, this frozen majesty, magnificent and cold and utterly cut off from the people he ruled. It was designed to inspire awe and to make the emperor's person too sacred to murder lightly. It did not really work at stopping the murders, but it did put a vast distance between the ruler and the ruled, and that distance too was part of what was dying. The empire was becoming a thing you obeyed and feared, rather than a thing you belonged to and loved, and they realized that the empire had simply grown too large for one man to defend. The frontiers were too long, the enemies too many, the distances too great. While an emperor fought the tribes on the northern river, the eastern border was left open, and the moment he marched east, some general on the northern border, left in command of an army, would be tempted to make himself emperor in turn. The very size of the thing was killing it, so they divided it. At first they tried an even bolder scheme. One strong emperor, seeing that the empire was too much for any single man, deliberately split the supreme power 4 ways among 4 rulers, 2 senior and 2 junior, each governing a quarter of the Roman world, each guarding a stretch of the endangered frontiers, all of them meant to work together as a team and to hand power on in an orderly way when the time came, the seniors retiring and the juniors moving up. It was an ingenious idea, born of hard experience, an attempt to fix by design the one flaw that had nearly destroyed everything, the lack of a safe way to pass on power. And for one generation, under the iron will of the man who devised it, it actually worked. The frontiers were held. The crisis was ended. The empire was saved. And then that one strong man did the almost unheard of thing of voluntarily giving up his power and retiring to grow vegetables in his garden by the sea, and the moment he was gone, the whole clever machine fell apart. The 4 rulers turned on each other. Sons felt they should inherit and would not wait their turn. Within a few years, the empire was back in civil war, 4 and then more rivals fighting for the throne, until one man defeated all the others and made himself sole master of the Roman world once more. The dream of the orderly partnership was dead. But the underlying idea that the empire was too big for one man and had to be divided did not die. It came back again and again because it was simply true. This was the great and fateful decision, and everything that follows flows from it. They split the empire in 2, an eastern half and a western half, each with its own emperor, its own capital, its own armies, its own government. The idea was sound enough. 2 emperors could guard 2 frontiers, 2 governments could manage a world too big for one. And for a while it worked. It steadied the ship. It stopped the endless civil wars for a time by giving the great commanders their own spheres to rule. But a thing that is divided is never quite one thing again. The two halves of the Roman world began slowly to drift apart. They had always been a little different. The eastern half was older, richer, more crowded, its great cities ancient, long before Rome was born. Its common tongue not Latin but Greek. The western half was younger, rougher, poorer, more thinly settled, more purely Roman in speech and in feeling. As long as they had been one empire, these differences had not mattered much. Now, with a line drawn between them and a separate emperor on each side, they began to matter more and more. The two halves began to look to their own defense, their own interests, their own survival. And when the great storms finally came, as they were coming, the two halves would not always stand together. Sometimes the richer, stronger East would look to its own safety and let the West face the storm alone. And there was a terrible imbalance hidden in the division, one that would decide everything in the end. The East was rich. It had the great trading cities, the ancient centers of wealth, the fertile lands, the deep reserves of money and people. The West was poor by comparison, its wealth thinner, its cities smaller, its frontiers longer and more exposed, facing the wildest of the tribes across the great northern rivers. So when the storms came, the East had the resources to buy off its enemies, to hire them, to bribe them, to turn them aside, to pay for walls and armies and diplomacy. And the West, poorer, more exposed, with less to give and more frontier to hold, did not. Again and again in the years to come, the East would find the gold to send the danger elsewhere, and elsewhere, so often, meant West. The richer twin survived by steering the storms toward the poorer one. The division that was meant to save the whole empire ended by saving one half and dooming the other. The East would live on and prosper and endure for another 1,000 years. The West would take the full weight of the fall, and there was a new capital. The old emperors began to abandon the city of Rome itself. This is one of the strangest and most telling things in the whole story, and people rarely notice it. Rome, the eternal city, the heart of everything, the center of the world for 1,000 years, slowly stopped being the place where the emperors lived. It was too far from the frontiers, where the real work of defending the empire had to be done. So the emperors moved to cities closer to the action, in the north, in the east, wherever the threat was greatest. And in time, a great new capital was founded in the east, a second Rome, a magnificent Christian city on the water at the crossroads of the continents, built to be the new heart of the empire, and it would become one of the greatest cities in the history of the world, and it would outlive the old Rome by 1,000 years. But that meant that Rome itself, the actual city, was becoming slowly a backwater. A grand, sacred, enormous backwater, full of monuments and memories, still vast, still holy in the minds of everyone, but no longer where the power was. The emperors ruled from elsewhere. The city of 1 million people began, slowly, to shrink. The center had moved, and the old heart was being left behind, a museum of its own glory, still magnificent, but no longer beating quite as it once had. There is something haunting in that, when you stop to feel it. For 1,000 years, Rome had been the point around which the whole world turned. Every road led to it. Every ambition ended in it. To say the city, with no other name, anywhere in that vast empire, was to mean Rome, and everyone understood. And now, gently, without anyone deciding it, without a single battle lost or a single wall breached, the city was slipping out of the center of things. The emperors were born elsewhere, ruled elsewhere, died elsewhere. Some of the later emperors of the West would rule their whole reigns and scarcely ever set foot in Rome at all. The eternal city was becoming a kind of sacred relic of itself, revered, protected, a little unreal, like an old temple that everyone bows to, and no one truly lives in anymore. The heart went on beating, but it had moved into another body, and the old one was left to grow quiet and to wait, without knowing what it was waiting for. Now, to hold this new, harder empire together, to pay for the doubled armies and the doubled courts and the endless wars, the state had to reach deeper into the lives of its people than it ever had before. And this is the quiet tragedy of the later empire, the part that never makes it into the grand stories of battles and emperors, but that mattered more than any of them to the people who actually lived it. The taxes became crushing. To fund everything, the state squeezed its people harder and harder, and it built a vast machinery of officials to do the squeezing, an enormous, hungry government that sat on top of the population and pressed. And to make sure the taxes could always be collected, the state began, step by step, to freeze people in place. A farmer was bound to his land, forbidden to leave it, so that he could always be found and taxed, and his children after him, and their children, tied to the same soil forever. A man in a vital trade, a baker, a shipper, a maker of weapons, was bound to that trade for life, and his sons bound after him, whether they willed it or not. Town councillors, once an honor, became a trap, because the councillors were made personally responsible for collecting their town's taxes, and if the town fell short, they had to make up the difference out of their own pockets, so that men who had once competed for the honor now fled from it, or bankrupted themselves under it. And the government that did all this squeezing grew and grew, a swarm of officials and clerks and inspectors and collectors, each of them living off the labor of the people below, each of them another mouth the taxes had to feed. There is a bitter old saying from those years that there had come to be more people living off the state than there were people paying into it, more hands taking than hands giving. Whether that was literally true or not, it captured the feeling of it exactly. The empire had become a vast weight of officials and soldiers and courtiers, pressing down on a shrinking number of farmers and workers who had to carry all of it on their backs. And the more the weight pressed, the more the workers beneath it were crushed and fled, or gave up, or sank into a kind of quiet despair, working land that was no longer really theirs, to pay taxes to a state that no longer really protected them, in a world that grew a little poorer and a little greyer with every passing year. Do you see what was happening? The free and mobile world of the Golden Age, the world where a nobody could come to the city and become something, where goods and people flowed freely across the whole earth, was slowly, quietly, hardening into something rigid and frozen and closed. People were being locked into place, generation after generation, farmer's son to farmer, baker's son to baker, soldier's son to soldier, all so that the desperate, hungry state could always find them and tax them and use them. The empire was surviving, but the life was going out of it. The thing that had made Rome Rome, the openness, the movement, the freedom, the sense that the world was wide and full of possibility, was being slowly strangled by the very effort to keep the empire alive. And for the ordinary farmer, caught in that vice, something strange and telling began to happen. The taxes of the state and the dangers of the age grew so heavy that the small free farmer, who had once been the backbone and the pride of Rome, could no longer stand on his own. And so, more and more, he gave himself up. He went to some great local landowner, some powerful man with a fortified villa and armed retainers, and he handed over his little farm and his freedom in exchange for protection. He became, in effect, the great man's tenant, bound to his land, working it for a share, sheltered by his lord's power against the tax collector and the raider alike. The state was becoming too dangerous and too greedy to live under directly, and so people crept, for safety, under the wing of whatever strong man was nearest. If that sounds familiar, it should, because it is the very beginning of the world that would come after Rome. The great fortified estate, the powerful lord, the bound tenant who works his land and looks to him for protection instead of to any distant state. The shape of the Middle Ages, the shape of the 1,000 years that would follow the fall, was already forming, quietly, inside the dying body of the empire, growing in its cracks like ivy in a ruin, long before the empire itself was gone. The new world was being born inside the old one, and hardly anyone noticed. And here is the deepest irony of it, the one I want you to carry into sleep tonight. The measures that saved the empire were the same measures that hollowed it out. To survive the storm, Rome had to become a thing that fewer and fewer of its people had any reason to love. The remote god-emperor, the crushing taxes, the frozen society, the vast grinding machinery of the state, all of it kept the empire standing, and all of it drained away, drop by drop, the loyalty and the love and the belief that had truly held it together. You cannot save a thing by turning it into its own opposite. But when you are drowning, you grab whatever will keep you afloat, even if it is the very weight that will, in the end, pull you under. And there was one more great change in these years, perhaps the deepest of all, and it would outlast everything else, outlast the empire itself, and remake the whole world that came after. The empire changed its gods. For 1,000 years, Rome had worshipped a great crowd of gods, the old gods of the state, and had let its many peoples worship their own besides, an easygoing jumble of temples and altars and festivals, in which the emperor himself was counted among the gods and worshipped across the empire. And through all the centuries of that, there had been a small, stubborn, growing faith, born in a distant eastern province, that worshipped one god only, and refused to worship the emperor, and was for that reason feared and hated and now and then savagely persecuted. Its followers were thrown to the beasts in the arena for the pleasure of the crowd. They were burned and crucified and killed in every way the Roman imagination could devise, and they did not stop. They multiplied. The blood of them, one of their own writers said, was like a seed, and the more of them were killed, the more of them there seemed to be. And then, in the very century of the great crisis and the great transformation, one of those hard soldier emperors who remade the Roman world did the most unexpected thing of all. He stopped fighting the new faith and embraced it. He became its protector, and then in time, the empire itself became a thing it had spent 3 centuries trying to destroy. The old gods, the gods of 1,000 years, began to fade. Their temples closed, their festivals ended. The new god, the one God, rose in their place, until the empire that had fed the followers of that faith to the lions became itself the great earthly power of that same faith. It was an enormous change, deeper than any change of border or emperor, a change in the very soul of the Roman world, and it would prove to be the most lasting thing Rome ever did. Long after the legions were gone, and the frontiers had dissolved, and the Western Empire was only a memory, that faith would remain, would spread, would inherit the very idea of Rome and carry it forward through the dark centuries to come. The empire was dying, and being reborn at the same time, in more ways than one, and the world that would rise from its ruins was already quietly being born inside it. There is a strange comfort in that thought, and it is worth holding as we go toward the ending. Because it means the story we are telling is not really a story of death. It is a story of transformation, of one world dissolving slowly into another, of the old passing into the new so gradually that no one could say exactly where the one ended and the other began. Even as the empire failed, it was handing on its gifts, its language, its law, its roads, its faith, its very memory, to the peoples and the ages that would come after, so that nothing truly great about it would ever be entirely lost. But we are running ahead of ourselves again, all the way to the end. Let us come back to the frontier and the gathering storm, and out beyond the frontiers the storm was still gathering, because we have not yet spoken, not really, of the barbarians, and it is time we did, because the word means almost the opposite of what most people think, and the truth of who they were and how they came in is the key to the whole ending. We picture the barbarians as savages, wild men from the forests, painted and howling, pouring over the walls to burn and destroy a civilization they hated and could not understand. That picture is almost entirely wrong, and the truth is far sadder and far more human. The peoples beyond the northern frontiers, the tribes in the great forests and plains, were not the mindless destroyers of legend. They were farmers and herders and warriors with their own kings and their own laws and their own rich way of life. And for centuries they had lived alongside Rome, trading with it, learning from it, serving in its armies, watching it across the river with a mixture of fear and hunger and deep admiration. They did not want to destroy Rome. That is the thing to understand. Most of them wanted more than anything to get in, to come inside the warm, bright circle of Roman civilization, to have its wealth and its comfort and its safety, to become Roman themselves. Rome was not a thing they hated. It was a thing they longed for. And for a long time Rome had let them in a little at a time, on its own terms. It had settled tribes along the frontier as farmers and guards. It had recruited their young men into the legions in ever greater numbers, until much of the Roman army was made of these frontier peoples, fighting Rome's wars, defending Rome's borders, often against their own distant kin. There were barbarian generals commanding Roman armies. There were men born in the forests who rose to the very heights of the Roman state. The line between Roman and barbarian, which we imagine as a sharp wall, was in truth a wide and blurry borderland, and people and goods and blood flowed across it in both directions all the time. And the tribes themselves were changing, precisely because of Rome. Living for generations along the frontier, trading with the empire, serving in its armies, they had grown more organized, more settled, more sophisticated, absorbing Roman ways and Roman goods and Roman ideas. Their kings drank Roman wine from Roman cups and wore Roman ornaments and dreamed of Roman honors. Many of them had adopted the new Roman faith, becoming, in their own way, followers of the same God the empire now worshipped. They were not strangers to Rome. They were its neighbors, its pupils, its admirers, its soldiers, half Roman already in 100 ways, standing at the edge of the warm, bright circle and wanting nothing so much as to step inside it. That is the great and tragic irony at the heart of the ending, and I want you to hold it because it changes everything about how you see what is coming. The people who would, in the end, bring down the Western Empire were not its haters. They were its admirers. They did not come to destroy Rome. They came to join it. They wanted to be Roman more than they wanted almost anything, and it was partly Rome's own failure to let them in cleanly, to absorb them fairly, to treat them as the people they were, that turned that longing in the end so terribly sour. So the barbarians were not, most of them, an enemy hammering at the gate. They were more like a crowd of people pressed up against the door, wanting to be let in and being let in slowly, in a trickle that Rome could manage and absorb. The catastrophe came when the trickle became a flood, when out of the deep east, out of the vast grasslands beyond the edge of the world Rome knew, something terrible came driving westward. A fierce and warlike people on horseback, and fell upon the tribes at the edge of the Roman world and shattered them and sent them running for their lives. These horsemen from the east were like nothing the tribes had ever faced. They seemed to live on their horses, to be almost part of their horses, riding and shooting with a speed and a skill that was terrifying, appearing out of nowhere, striking and vanishing. They came in numbers beyond counting, out of a homeland no one knew, driven west by causes no one understood, and they rolled over the peoples in their path like a wave over sandcastles. The tribes who had lived for generations along the Roman frontier, who had their own kings and their own strength and their own pride, were simply broken by this thing coming out of the east, defeated and enslaved and scattered, and those who could ran west, ran for the one place that might be strong enough to shelter them, ran for Rome. Picture it from the Roman side of the river. For centuries, the frontier had been a settled thing, the tribes on the far bank known and dealt with, the balance familiar. And then, over a few short years, the far bank fills up with desperate, terrified multitudes, whole nations uprooted, pressing toward the water, and behind them, glimpsed, the horsemen who had done this, a horror driving a horror before it. Suddenly the peoples beyond the frontier were no longer a manageable trickle asking politely to be let in. They were entire nations, whole peoples with their wagons and their women, and their children and their herds, fleeing in terror from something worse behind them, arriving at the Roman river not as a trickle but as a desperate multitude, begging to be allowed across, to be let inside the frontier, to be given land and safety inside the empire, away from the horror at their backs. And Rome, faced with this, had a choice to make. And how it made that choice, and how badly it went, is where we will pick up the story next. Because the moment that flood reached the river is the moment the ending truly began. Everything before was the long, slow widening of the cracks. What came after was the fall itself. For Rome could have done this well. It had absorbed newcomers before over and over for centuries. It knew how. Settle them fairly, feed them, treat them with honor. Give them land and a stake in the empire, and in a generation they would be Romans like any other, and the empire would be stronger for the new blood, as it had been strengthened 100 times before. The desperate people at the river were not, in that moment, enemies. They were a gift if Rome had the wisdom to receive it. Hundreds of thousands of brave fighters and hard workers asking only to be let in, ready to be loyal, ready to be Roman, ready even to defend the empire that sheltered them. But an empire that is frightened and greedy and cruel and hollowed out does not treat desperate people well. And the men Rome sent to receive that flood at the river would prove to be frightened and greedy and cruel, and out of their cruelty, out of a betrayal at the water's edge, would come the spark that lit the whole long fire of the ending. But that, as I say, is where we go next. Tonight let the empire rest in its strange, hard, wounded survival. It did not fall in the great crisis. It was saved. Battered, transformed, frozen, drained, but saved, still standing, still vast, still Roman, holding its long frontiers against the gathering dark. Let it stand there a little longer in the grey afternoon light, weary but unbroken, not yet knowing what is coming down the road toward it. So rest now, wherever you are, in whatever hour has found you. Let the long frontiers hold through the night. Let the watchfires burn along the great rivers, and the sentries walk the walls, and the tired old empire keep its vigil against the dark beyond. It has survived so much already. It has been to the edge of death and come back. Let it believe a little longer that it always will. There is nothing you need to carry tonight. The taxes are not yours to pay. The frontiers are not yours to hold. It was all so very long ago, and everyone who lived it has been at peace for 1,500 years, and it is only a story now, a slow, sad, quiet story, to carry you gently down into sleep. Let your breathing slow. Let the watchfires blur and fade. Let the wounded empire keep its long watch through the night, weary and enduring, as the shadows gather at the edge of the world. And sleep now. The frontier still holds. The rivers still run between the empire and the dark. The sentries still walk the walls, and the legions still answer the trumpet, and the eagles still stand. It is all still there tonight, wounded and weary and changed almost beyond knowing, but still there, still Roman, still holding. For a little while longer it always did. It began with a betrayal at the edge of a river. That is where we left the story last time. A whole people, hundreds of thousands of them, driven from their homes by a terror out of the east, arriving at the great river that marked the Roman frontier and begging to be let across, begging to be let in, asking only for land and safety and a place inside the warm, bright circle of the empire, away from the horror at their backs. And Rome said yes. That is the thing to hold on to, because it is where it all turned. Rome said yes. The emperor in the east agreed to let this people cross the river and settle inside the empire. It could have been a triumph. Hundreds of thousands of strong, brave, desperate people, ready to be loyal, ready to be Roman, ready to farm the empty lands and fill the ranks of the armies. Rome had done this before, many times, and grown stronger for it. It should have been the saving of the empire, not the ending of it. But it went wrong. It went wrong because the men Rome sent to manage the crossing were greedy and cruel, and they saw in this flood of desperate refugees not a gift, but a chance to enrich themselves. They were supposed to feed the newcomers, who had left their harvests behind and had nothing. Instead, they hoarded the food and sold it at monstrous prices. They let the refugees starve. And then, when the starving people had nothing left, the Roman officials sold them dogs to eat, one dog for one child, taken away into slavery. That is not a legend. That is what the Roman writers themselves recorded, in shame. Roman officials, faced with a starving people who had come to them for help, took their children in payment for dogs. Tonight, we come to the end of the long story, the fall itself, the sack of the eternal city, and then the slow guttering out of the light in the west, and the last emperor, a boy with a borrowed name, and the strange quiet afternoon when Rome ended and almost no one noticed, and then, at the very end, the thing that makes this not a story of death after all. But we will come to that. First though, if these quiet journeys through the deep past have brought you any peace across these nights, take a moment to subscribe, so the next one can find its way to you when you need it. And I would love to know, from wherever you are resting tonight, in whatever corner of the world you happen to be, where are you listening from, and what hour has it reached where you are? Leave it in the comments below. It is a lovely thing to see all the places and all the hours, all of us drifting off together at the end of our days. And now, one last time, let your shoulders come down, and let your breathing slow, and let the day you have carried fall gently away. Come with me back to the Roman world, to the banks of that river, where a betrayal is about to set the whole long ending in motion. The starving people, robbed and abused and dying, did the only thing left to do. They rose up, a whole nation, armed and desperate and betrayed, in arms inside the empire's own frontier, with nothing left to lose. And the Emperor of the East gathered a great army and marched to crush them, confident, because Rome had always crushed such things before. Understand the tragedy of it, because it did not have to happen. These people had come in peace. They had crossed the river as refugees, laying down their weapons as they were told, submitting to Rome, asking only to live. Every single thing that followed, all the blood and the ruin and the long unraveling, flowed not from their savagery, but from Rome's own cruelty and greed at the water's edge. If the officials had simply fed them, as they were supposed to, as it would have cost so little to do, these people would have become farmers and soldiers of the empire, and the frontier would have held, and the story might have been entirely different. Instead, a handful of greedy men, for a little profit, turned hundreds of thousands of grateful newcomers into a desperate, furious army. It is one of the great what-ifs of history, one of those small moments of ordinary human cruelty that turn the course of the whole world. The empire was not brought down in the end by the strength of its enemies. It was brought down again and again by its own failures, its own fear, its own greed, its own blindness. The barbarians only walked through doors that Rome, one way or another, left open, and on a hot day on a wide plain, the unthinkable happened. The Roman army was not just beaten, it was destroyed, annihilated. The emperor himself was killed, his body never found, perhaps burned alive in a farmhouse where he took shelter, as the battle turned into a massacre. Tens of thousands of Roman soldiers died on that field. The finest army of the Eastern Empire, wiped out by the very refugees they had come to punish. It was one of the worst defeats in the whole history of Rome, and it sent a shudder through the entire Roman world because of what it proved. It proved that a barbarian people inside the frontier could meet a full Roman army in open battle and destroy it utterly. The spell was broken. The thing that had held for so long, the sense that Rome, whatever its troubles, was still militarily unbeatable at its core, was gone. Everyone had seen it now. Rome could be beaten. Rome could be beaten by the very peoples it had always despised. And nothing would ever be quite the same again. There had been dark days before, of course, terrible defeats in the deep past, but always Rome had come back, had raised new armies, had ground its enemies down in the end, through sheer relentless will and endless reserves of men. That was the old Roman way, to lose battle after battle and win the last one, to simply refuse to accept defeat until the enemy broke. But those days were gone, and this defeat was different because now the reserves were not there, the manpower was thin, the money was short, the will was faltering. Rome could no longer simply absorb a catastrophe and grind on. Each blow now landed on a body too weak to fully heal, and the wounds began to stay open and to fester, one atop another, and the great slow bleeding of the Western Empire had truly begun. After that, the empire never fully got the newcomers out and never fully brought them under control. A great armed people now lived inside the Roman frontiers, sometimes allied to Rome, fighting in its wars, sometimes at war with it, never again simply subjects. And they were only the first. Behind them, the pressure at the frontiers kept building, more peoples driven west by the same far-off terror, until one terrible winter the frontier itself gave way. A great river in the north froze solid, and across the ice, in their tens of thousands, whole nations poured into the empire at once, no longer asking permission, and this time there was no army that could stop them, and no one even really tried. They spread out across the western provinces, into the rich lands that had not seen an enemy in centuries, and they did not leave. They came to stay. And now something happened that tells you more than any battle how far gone the Western Empire truly was. As these peoples moved through its provinces, the Western Empire could not fight them all. It did not have the soldiers or the money or the will, so instead more and more it made deals. It gave them land. It gave them whole provinces to settle in exchange for their loyalty or their military service or simply their agreement to stop moving. It hired one barbarian people to fight another. It settled them as allies inside its own borders, governing themselves, under their own kings, on Roman soil. Do you see what that means? The Western Empire was slowly dissolving from within, not by being conquered in one great blow, but by being parceled out, province by province, deal by deal, to the very peoples it could no longer keep out. The map still said Rome. The emperors still reigned. But on the ground, in reality, more and more of the West was being ruled by barbarian kings who happened, for now, to call themselves friends and allies of Rome. The empire was being hollowed out from the inside, its provinces quietly becoming kingdoms, while the fiction of a single Roman world was politely maintained by everyone, because no one quite knew what else to do. And the ordinary people in the middle of this often barely felt the change and sometimes even welcomed it. For a farmer in a distant province, crushed under the impossible taxes of the dying empire, hunted by its officials, protected by no one, the arrival of a barbarian king who taxed more lightly and kept better order could feel less like a catastrophe than a relief. There are Roman writers of the time who admit, with something like shame, that many of the poor of the empire actually fled to the barbarians, preferring to live under barbarian kings than to bear the crushing weight of Roman taxation and Roman corruption any longer. Think of what that tells you. The empire had become, for many of its own people, a heavier burden than the barbarians it was supposedly protecting them from. When a state grows so hungry and so cruel that its own people would rather be conquered than keep paying its taxes, that state is already in its heart finished, whatever the map still says. The loyalty had drained away, drop by drop, over the long grey generations, until there was little left to hold the thing together but habit and inertia and the fading memory of a greatness that no one living had ever seen. And then came the thing that told the whole world the truth, the sack of Rome itself. But first, there was a man who held the whole tottering West together with his bare hands for a while, and his story is the story of the West in miniature, and it breaks your heart. He was the great general of his age, the man who commanded the armies of the West in its last decades of real strength, who beat back invasion after invasion, who won the empire time it did not deserve. And he was himself half barbarian, the son of a man from one of the frontier peoples, risen to the very summit of the Roman world by sheer ability. He was the shield of the West. For years, whenever the storm broke, it was he who stood in the gap. And the Roman court, jealous, frightened of his power, listening to whispers that a man of barbarian blood could not be trusted, turned on him. The emperor he had served and saved had him arrested and executed, cut down by the very state he had spent his life defending. And then, as if to prove how foolish they had been, the court let its soldiers massacre the families of the barbarian troops who served in the Roman armies, the wives and children in the towns of Italy. And those soldiers, tens of thousands of them, hardened veterans who had fought for Rome, did the only thing left to them. They walked out of the Roman camps and went over to the enemy, to the very barbarian king who was even then threatening the city. Rome had murdered its own best defender and then driven its own best soldiers into the arms of its enemy out of fear and jealousy and blindness. And with that, the last real strength of the West was thrown away and the road to the city lay open. For 800 years, no foreign enemy had entered the city of Rome. 800 years. Through all the wars, all the crises, all the civil strife, the city itself had never fallen to an outside foe. It had become almost a law of nature. Rome was not taken. Rome was never taken. It was one of the fixed certainties of the world. Can then a barbarian king, a Christian ironically, a man who had served in the Roman armies and wanted nothing more than a proper home for his people inside the empire, was cheated and betrayed by the Roman government one time too many, and he brought his people to the walls of Rome, and after a siege the gates were opened, perhaps by a slave, perhaps by treachery, perhaps by starvation, and for the first time in 8 centuries, a foreign army walked into the streets of the Eternal City. The sack itself was, by the standards of the age, almost restrained. The king was a Christian and gave orders that the churches be spared and that those who sheltered in them be left unharmed, and much of the city survived. It lasted only 3 days and then they left, laden with treasure, but leaving the city still standing. Measured against the horrors that cities usually suffered when they fell, Rome got off lightly. Picture it, though, from inside the walls. 1 million people had once lived in this city, and though it had shrunk, it was still vast, still crowded, still the greatest city in the Western world, and its people had grown up in the absolute certainty that this could never happen. For 800 years, it had not happened. Their grandparents and their great-grandparents, back through 30 generations, had lived and died in a city that no enemy had ever entered. And now, in the night, the gates stood open, and there were barbarian soldiers in the streets, in the forums, in the temples, moving through the hallowed heart of the world, taking what they pleased. The rich fled or hid or were taken for ransom. The great houses were plundered. The proud old families of Rome, who traced their names back 1,000 years, saw their treasures carried off and their daughters seized. It was not the bloodiest sack in history, but it was Rome, and that was enough to shake the foundations of the world. But it did not matter how restrained it was. What mattered was that it had happened at all. The news went out across the whole world like a thunderclap, and everywhere people received it with disbelief and horror. Rome had fallen. The eternal city, the mother of the world, the fixed and unshakable center of everything, had been taken and plundered by barbarians. People who had never seen Rome, who lived thousands of miles away, wept when they heard it. Far away in a monastery in the east, an old scholar who had spent his life translating the sacred texts wrote that when he heard the news, his voice failed and sobs choked his words, that the city which had conquered the whole world had itself been conquered, and that if Rome could perish, what could ever be safe? A great Christian thinker, far away in Africa, was so shaken by the news that he sat down and wrote an enormous book to make sense of it, to explain how the earthly city of Rome could fall, and yet the true and eternal city, the city of God, endure. It was as if the sky had cracked, as if something that could not happen had happened. If Rome could fall, then nothing was safe, nothing was permanent, the world itself was mortal. Rest there for a moment in the shock of it, because it is one of the great turning points in the history of the world, and it deserves a moment of stillness. The unthinkable had become real. The one certainty that everyone in the Western world had carried in their hearts, that Rome was eternal, was simply gone and could never be recovered. Even though the empire staggered on for another lifetime after this, in a way the real ending was here, in this moment, when the whole world learned that Rome could fall, because once you know that a thing can end, it has, in the deepest sense, already ended. The magic that had held it together, the belief was broken, and belief once broken cannot be mended. Let that settle over you gently, the way a great sad piece of news settles and softens and becomes, at last, something you can rest beside. After the sack, the Western Empire lingered on for another 70 years or so, but it was dying now and everyone could feel it. It grew smaller and smaller. Province after province slipped away, becoming barbarian kingdoms in all but name, until the great and distant provinces and then the nearer ones were simply gone, no longer sending their taxes or their soldiers or answering the emperor's call. The rich, fertile lands of the North African coast, the breadbasket that had fed the city of Rome for centuries, were taken by another barbarian people who crossed the sea and built a kingdom and a fleet, and with that fleet they too, in time, came and sacked Rome a second time, more thoroughly than the first. This second sack was crueler than the first, a slow and thorough stripping of the city over many days, the treasures carried off across the sea, the great bronze roof tiles torn from the temples, the gold and the art and the sacred things of 1,000 years loaded onto ships and taken away. And the very name of that people became, ever afterward, a word for the wanton destruction of beautiful things, a word we still use today without knowing where it came from, a small dark monument in our own language to the day they stripped Rome bare. The Western Empire was shrinking back, province by province, toward Italy alone, toward the city itself, like a great fire dying down at last to a few embers. And in the middle of all this dissolving, there came out of the east the very terror that had started it all, the horsemen of the steppe, now united under one dreaded king, the most feared man of the age, a name that made the whole world tremble, called by later ages the Scourge of God. He swept into the west with a vast host, burning and destroying, demanding tribute, demanding a Roman princess as his bride and half the empire as her dowry, and it seemed for a moment that he might sweep the whole of the west away before him. And in the face of that terror, something happened that tells you everything about how tangled the ending truly was. The Romans and the barbarians joined together against him. The great Roman general of the West and the barbarian kings who had settled inside the empire, the very peoples who were carving up the western provinces between them, stood side by side on a great plain in a huge and bloody battle, Roman and barbarian shoulder to shoulder. And together they turned back the horsemen from the east. The men who were dismantling the empire and the men defending it fought as allies to save the West from something they all feared more. And a little later, the dreaded king of the horsemen died, suddenly. On the night of his own wedding, and his empire of terror fell apart as quickly as it had risen, and the danger passed. But the West had been saved by an alliance of the very peoples who were even then inheriting it. The line between Rome and barbarian had blurred so completely that they now died together to defend a world that was slipping, all the same, out of Roman hands and into theirs. And the emperors in these final years were pitiful things. Boys, most of them, puppets, raised up and cast down by whichever general or barbarian warlord truly held the power behind the throne. The real rulers of what was left of the West were now, more often than not, the barbarian commanders of the armies, men of the very peoples who had once stood outside the frontier, now standing at the very center of Roman power, making and unmaking emperors at will, because the emperors were only symbols now, and everyone knew it. And so we come to the end, to the last one. The last emperor of the West was a boy, a child, put on the throne by his father, a powerful general, as a figurehead, a symbol, nothing more. And there is a terrible, gentle irony in his name, an irony so perfect that it almost seems invented, though it is true. This last emperor of Rome bore by chance the names of both the founder of the city 1,000 years before and the founder of the empire. He carried in his own small person the names of the very beginning of Rome, and he was its very end. He reigned for a few months, this boy, as the last scraps of the Western Empire dissolved around him. And then a barbarian general, the commander of the empire's own barbarian soldiers, decided that the charade was no longer worth maintaining. He did not even bother to kill the boy. He simply removed him from the throne and pensioned him off, and sent him away to live out his life quietly on an estate by the sea, with an allowance forgotten. And that was that. There is something almost unbearably gentle about that ending, when you sit with it. They did not kill the last emperor of Rome. This boy, who carried in his name the whole 1,000 years of the story, the founder and the first emperor both, was simply, kindly set aside, given a comfortable house, given money to live on, told, in effect, that he need not trouble himself with being emperor anymore, that the job was finished, that he could go and be a private person now and rest. And so far as we know, he did. He went to live by the sea, in a beautiful place, and he vanishes from history there. An ordinary young man with an extraordinary name, living quietly on his pension, perhaps for many years, perhaps growing old, watching the waves come in, the last emperor of the West, entirely forgotten by a world that had already moved on and hardly noticed he was gone. I find that unbearably moving somehow. Not a death, not a tragedy in the grand sense, just a boy, told he could stop now, sent to rest by the sea. As if the empire itself, so unimaginably old and tired, had at last been allowed to lie down and close its eyes. There was no great battle, no burning of the city, no last stand. The last emperor of the West was simply retired, like an official whose post had been abolished, and no one bothered to appoint another. The barbarian general who had done it did not even claim the title of emperor for himself. He sent the imperial robes and crown away to the emperor in the east, with a message, in effect, that the West no longer needed an emperor of its own, that one emperor, far away in the east, was enough for the whole Roman world now. And so it ended, not with a bang, not with a scream, but with a shrug, with a piece of administrative tidying up. The office of the Emperor of the West was simply allowed to lapse, like a subscription no one renewed, and the date of it, that quiet, unremarkable year, is the date we now write in the books as the fall of Rome. The end of the ancient world, the end of the 1,000-year empire. And yet, even to call it the fall of Rome is only half true, and it is worth saying so because it makes the ending gentler still. For the empire did not fall everywhere, only the west fell. In the east, the richer half, the half with the great new capital on the water, the Roman Empire did not fall at all. It lived on. It went right on calling itself the Roman Empire, its people calling themselves Romans, for another 1,000 years. 1,000 years. The Eastern Roman Empire outlasted the fall of the West by as long as the whole distance between us and the deep Middle Ages. It preserved the learning, the law, the faith, the memory of Rome, and shone as one of the great civilizations of the world for 10 more centuries. And once, not long after the West fell, a great Eastern emperor even reconquered much of it for a time, took back Italy and Rome itself and North Africa, and for a brief shining moment, the empire was almost whole again, before the effort exhausted it and the lands slipped away once more. So Rome did not so much fall as recede in the West, while enduring in the East. The light did not go out. It withdrew, slowly eastward, and dimmed in the western lands, and other lights, smaller and newer, were kindled from it in the darkness it left behind. And even in the West, the fall was less a death than a long, slow handing over, an empire becoming a family of kingdoms, all of them still lit, however faintly, by the fire they had inherited. And here is the strangest and most human thing of all, and I want you to carry it with you into sleep, because it changes the whole meaning of the story. Almost no one noticed. There was no announcement that an age had ended. The people alive at the time did not wake up the next morning knowing that Rome had fallen, and the ancient world was over, and the Dark Ages had begun. How could they? To them it was just one more year, one more change of the men at the top, in a century that had seen 100 such changes. The sun came up. The farmers worked their fields, the same fields, bound to them as their fathers had been. The taxes were still collected, now by a barbarian king instead of a Roman emperor. But they were still collected in much the same way by many of the same officials. The great landowners still ruled their estates. The churches still held their services. The old roads still ran, the old cities still stood. People still spoke Latin and lived Roman lives in a Roman landscape. In fact, the barbarian king who now ruled Italy, the very man who had retired the last emperor, governed it as a thoroughly Roman place. He kept the Roman Senate, which still met, still debated, still carried its ancient dignity. He kept the Roman laws and the Roman officials and the Roman taxes and the Roman way of doing everything. He repaired the monuments. He protected the old families. He wrote respectful letters to the emperor in the East. If you had walked through Italy in the years just after the supposed fall of Rome, you would have seen a land at peace, more peaceful than it had been in generations, ruled in the Roman fashion, speaking the Roman tongue, living the Roman life, with only the origin of the man at the very top to tell you that anything at all had changed. The empire had not so much ended as quietly changed management and gone on for a while, almost exactly as before. The barbarian kings who now ruled did not think of themselves as the destroyers of Rome. They admired Rome. They wanted to be Roman. They kept the Roman officials, used the Roman laws, spoke the Roman tongue, and dreamed of Roman glory. Many of them ruled in the name of the distant emperor in the East and put his face on their coins and thought of themselves as part of the Roman world still. The fall of Rome was not an event. That is the great secret of it. It was not a day or a battle or a catastrophe. It was a fading, a long, slow, almost imperceptible fading over generations, so gradual that the people living through it mostly could not see it at all, the way you cannot see the hour hand of a clock move, though it moves. A child born in the last years of the empire would grow old in a world that was still, in most of the ways that touched daily life, recognizably Roman, and would perhaps never once think the thought, Rome has fallen. It fell so slowly that it never quite fell at all. It simply became something else, so gradually that no one could ever point to the moment and say, there, that is where it ended. And yet, over the long centuries that followed, the change was real, and much was lost, and we should not pretend otherwise. The great cities shrank. Rome itself, that had held 1 million people, dwindled over the centuries to a town of a few tens of thousands. its huge monuments looming over fields and pastures where sheep grazed among the ruins, its great aqueducts broken, its baths silent, its forums buried slowly under the earth. The long-distance trade withered. The making of fine things faltered. Reading and writing became rare, kept alive mostly in the monasteries, small islands of learning in a darkening sea. The roads fell into disrepair. The knowledge of how to build the great domes and aqueducts and baths was lost, some of it for 1,000 years. In much of the West, life became smaller, poorer, more local, more fearful, more bounded by the edge of the next village and the walls of the nearest strongman's stronghold. Something had been lost, some great wide brightness, and the people of the centuries that followed knew it, and looked back at the towering ruins around them, and wondered what giants had built them, and grieved, dimly, for a glory they could no longer even imagine. But even that darkness was not the whole truth, and it was never total. The light did not go out. It only dimmed and drew inward and waited. In the monasteries, the old books were copied and copied again and kept, so that the wisdom of Rome and of Greece was not lost but slept, waiting for a brighter age to wake it. The Church kept the language and the law and the memory. The barbarian kingdoms slowly grew into new nations, and those nations carried Roman blood and Roman speech and Roman ways in their very bones. And the idea of Rome, the memory of that one great order, glowed on in the dark like a banked fire, so that again and again, down the centuries, someone would try to build it anew. And that is the deepest truth of the whole long story, and the gentlest. Rome did not die. Not really. Not the way we imagine, in fire and ruin and a sudden fall into darkness. Rome dissolved slowly into the world that came after it, and that world was its child, made of its substance, carrying its blood. Because look at what remained. The language of Rome did not die. It lived on, and changed, and became the languages that hundreds of millions of people speak today. Across whole continents Rome never knew. Every time a person in Italy or Spain or France or Portugal or across the ocean in the Americas opens their mouth to speak, they are speaking a child of the language of Rome, worn smooth and changed by 1,500 years, but Roman still at the root, so that Rome speaks, in a sense, through the mouths of 500 million people every single day, and none of them think of it, and it is true all the same. The law of Rome did not die. It became the foundation of the law of much of the world, so that a judge today, on the far side of the earth, still reaches now and then for a principle first framed by Roman minds 2,000 years ago. The very ideas we use to think about justice, about contracts and property and rights and the state, so many of them were shaped in Rome, and passed down through all the centuries since, and are woven so deeply into how we see the world that we no longer even know they are Roman. We think they are simply how things are, but they are Rome still speaking, still shaping the world, long after the last emperor sailed away. The faith that Rome adopted at its end did not die. It spread across the whole world, carrying the memory and the language and the idea of Rome with it into every corner of the earth. The head of that faith, for much of the world, still sits in the city of Rome to this day, still uses the Roman tongue for its most solemn words, still bears a title the old Romans used, so that the eternal city remained, even after the empire was gone, a center of the world, drawing pilgrims from every land, exactly as it always had. The empire fell and the city rose again, transformed, and never truly lost its place at the heart of things. The roads remained, the great buildings remained, and still remain, standing in 100 cities, so that we walk among them still and feel small. The very idea of Rome remained so powerful that for 1,000 years afterward, kings and conquerors dreamed of restoring it, called themselves its heirs, took its titles, tried to build it again, because the memory of that one great order that had once united the world would not fade and has not faded even now. They wanted, at the very beginning, to build something eternal, an eternal city, and in the way they meant it, the marble and the power and the empire without end, they failed, as everything human fails in the end. The marble cracked, the power drained away. The empire dissolved into the mist of the passing centuries. But in another way, a way they could never have foreseen, they succeeded beyond anything they could have dreamed. Because here we are, you and I, 2,000 years later, on the far side of the world, in a language descended from theirs, in a civilization built on their foundations, still telling their story, still moved by their glory and their tragedy, still walking in our minds. Through their marble halls, they are not forgotten, they will never be forgotten. The eternal city turned out to be eternal after all, just not in the way they thought. It lives on in us. It lives on in nearly everything we are, and perhaps that is the truest kind of eternity there is, and the only kind that any of us can hope for. Not to last forever unchanged, hard and cold and permanent like marble, for nothing lasts that way, not empires, not cities, not people. But to pass on, to give what you have to the ones who come after, to pour yourself into them so completely that when you are gone, you are not really gone at all, but live on in them, in what they say and how they think and who they are, changed and carried forward and never quite lost. Rome did not get the eternity of marble. It got the eternity of a parent living on in a child, which is the only eternity that has ever truly existed, and it is enough. It is more than enough. It is everything. So let them rest now, all of them, the emperors in their tombs, the soldiers on the frontiers, the farmers in their fields, the million people of the great city, and the boy with the borrowed name who was the last of them all, living out his quiet days by the sea, the final emperor of Rome, watching the waves, an ordinary boy at the end of 1,000 years. Let the great empire rest, its long day over at last, its work done, its gifts given, its story told. Let the marble stand quiet in the moonlight, the broken arches and the silent forums, and the great arena empty under the stars. Let the roads run on through the dark to cities that have forgotten who first built them. Let the eternal city sleep, having become, in the end, more eternal than its builders ever knew, woven now into the very fabric of the world, into its words and its laws and its dreams, never to be lost, never to be truly gone. There is nothing left to hold up tonight, nothing left to defend. The long watch is over. The frontiers can be let go at last. It all happened so very long ago, and everyone who lived it, the great and the humble, the emperor and the slave, has been at peace now for 1,500 years. Their struggles ended, their fears stilled, their long day done. And the story of it, this long, slow story of glory and cracks and shadows and the gentle fading of the light, is only a story now, to carry you down at last into sleep, the way all the great old stories do. So let your breathing slow. Let the marble gleam and fade. Let the eternal city rest, and you rest with it, knowing that nothing truly good is ever entirely lost, that things do not so much end as change and pass on and become the next thing gently in their time, the way the day passes into evening and the evening into the quiet of the night. Let the long story go now, the glory and the cracks, the crisis and the shadows, the betrayal at the river and the open gates, and the boy sent away to rest by the sea. Let all of it settle and soften and grow still, the way the past always does in the end, until it is not sorrow anymore and not fear, but only a kind of quiet wonder that any of it happened at all, and gratitude that we still remember. Rome stood for 1,000 years and believed it would stand forever, and in the only way that finally matters, in memory, in language, in law, in the long, unbroken thread of everything that came after. It was right. Sleep now. The eternal city keeps its watch as it always has, as it always will, in the quiet of the night, forever.